Good morning. It's great to be back. We had 2 weeks down in Baton Rouge on vacation with Carrie's family, and took the first part of it and just blacked out, turned my cell phone off, computers off, everything, and just hid, and then kind of made the second week a working vacation, and so that I could let my wife and kids enjoy her parents and everything, and not drive back here and then drive back down to Baton Rouge and get them to drive back up here. That just sounded like hell itself. So so it was fun, man. We ate tons of Cajun food, gained lots of weight, and just played. It was awesome. So my brother-in-law actually does all of our graphics. He actually was there with his kids and Carrie's younger brother with his daughter and wife, and it was crazy, man. We had like 18 people, 20 people, whatever it is, all in one little house, and it was awesome. You know, it was like going to a NASCAR race in a tent. There's just people everywhere, like all cramped in. You know, like walking through the house like this. You know, but we had a great time. And but my brother-in-law made this little video of our time together. It's just, he never ceases to amaze me of what he does with that. And so it's up on the internet, and just kind of share a little bit about our vacation with you guys and our family. I'm so proud of both sides of my family, and just blessed to be a part of them. This morning, if you're a first-time guest, we're studying the teachings of Jesus on spirituality. These teachings of the God-man, Jesus Christ, who was human and God all at the same time. He's the second person of the Trinity. He walked among us, and he taught us as he walked among us. His purpose was to come and die to save us and to be resurrected. But in that process of establishing that, he taught us what it means to know God, how we can connect with God, and what that's all about. And so we call that spirituality. We spent the first half of this year looking into his teachings that contrast with religion, where Jesus really said, this is religion, this is spirituality, this is what God's about, this is not what God's about. They are two totally opposite things. And so we spent the first part of our year looking at those contrasts. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a different vantage point for the rest of the year. We're still going to see the contrast between spirituality and religion, but instead of our context being the contrast, what we're now going to do is just look at different issues and different teachings, different things that we look into as human beings, that we think about, and look at those in the context of spirituality. How did Jesus communicate it? And everything he did teach us was in that context. So this morning, we're going to start this process, our new vantage point, by looking in the teachings of Jesus on the subject of hell. Now, some of you are first-time guests. You're thinking, great. First time in church, I got to hear about hell. Hell, fire, and brimstone. There's going to be somebody with a fire under my seat telling me I can feel the heat of hell on my butt right now. We thought about turning the air conditioner off and trying to make it as hot as we could, but we didn't do that. And so you feel the sweat on your brow. That's not the heat. That's the Holy Spirit of God telling you you're close to hell. But we didn't choose that way. All right, what we want to do is we want to teach you this morning what Jesus said about the subject of hell. And I want to do it from a passage of Scripture that appears in Luke chapter 16. It's one of the more popular passages to look at on the subject of hell. However, it tends to be one of the most misinformed passages that people have. It starts mostly because a lot of people, when they look at Luke chapter 16 and Jesus' teaching on hell, they look at it as if they're reading the book of Romans, all right? The book of Romans in the Bible is a theological treatise, all right? It is meant to be took literal in the sense that every word is hung on each word like a manual would be that you're studying to operate some piece of machinery, all right? So the book of Romans is a theological manual, all right? These parables that Jesus teaches, however, are not. A parable is a fictional story. All right, a parable is a fictional story. If you're like me and you're half dyslexic, those academician librarian people really messed me up on this. Like, it would take an academician to come up with this, all right? Fiction means fake. Non-fiction means non-fake, thus real. Why couldn't they just come up with, why they got to make it like inverted like that, Why they got to make it complicated? So a parable is a fake made-up story to illustrate, everybody say illustrate. Illustrate a real absolute truth, all right? So it's a fake story to illustrate an absolute truth. Now, we handle that very differently than we would handle a teaching of Jesus per se, where he's directly given us a doctrine. This is truth. This is what I want you to believe. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. We handle a parable very differently, all right? It's an illustration. What Jesus gives here for us to peer into an understanding of what hell is, and consequently some things about heaven, is a parable. It's a parable that ironically is directed at a group of religious leaders. Jesus was teaching this mass multitude of people. They're all up on this hillside or wherever listening to Jesus. All right, forgot where it was. Brain just went blank. But he's teaching all these people, and he's gone on this long sermon, and all of a sudden these Pharisees, these religious leaders, come out and begin to mock Jesus. So they kind of work their way through the crowd. They come down in front of all the crowd, and they start mocking Jesus and making fun of what he's teaching and just ripping him to shreds. And Jesus, his attention turns from this mass audience of people that are listening, and he steers around and he focuses in on these Pharisees, these religious leaders, and then he tells them this parable. He is now speaking to the religious leaders. And so he comes up with this story. It's a very interesting story that Jesus tells to make a point. It's a story of two different characters and what happens to them in their life, and most importantly, what happens after death. Now, it begins in Luke chapter 16, verse 19. And all I'm doing, I'm just going to walk you through this passage. This is where we're going to spend most of our time this morning, just kind of opening this passage up and trying to understand it. One more point of clarity on why we're going to approach it this way. As in any story, when you make up a story, a fictional story, you're using things that are in context to your culture. So for instance, if I were to get in a time machine and go back 2,000 years ago and be standing on a hillside with Jesus and use an illustration to make a point, like this. And if I were to say to a Jewish audience 2,000 years ago, now, it's kind of like when Michael Jordan dunks a basketball. They don't know who Michael Jordan is. Don't know what a basketball is. The word dunk might mean something with baptism, all right? But they have no reference whatsoever to the illustration. Now, in the same way, much of the parables that Jesus teaches, we can understand a lot of it on the surface, but we're in a totally different culture, a totally different environment. So it's important for us when we study those parables to try to get around historians and people that can help us understand the context of the illustrations. And so that's what I want to do this morning. If you don't understand the context of illustrations, then we will miss the absolute truth that the fictional story is trying to give us. Or we'll mess it all up and take it to places it's not intended to be. So that's what I want to do first, is just walk you through this story and try to help pull us all back 2,000 years ago and really hear it as those would have heard it that existed when Jesus was teaching this. So in Luke chapter 16, verse 19, Jesus begins the story by telling us about the first character of his story. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day. Now, this is a Bill Gates kind of rich guy. He's chosen to tell us that this particular, there we go, is the light thing going crazy on us again? He's chosen to tell us that this particular character, all right, is so rich he can afford purple clothing. Now, immediately, because we're in 2012, we think Barney. Somebody walks by in purple clothing, we think that's not a person of wealth. That's a person who is either colorblind or that was all the clothes they had to wear, right? If you have purple on here today, I'm sorry. If you're a man and you have purple, if you're a woman, you're allowed to wear purple. If you're a man and you have purple and you're not an LSU fan, I'm trying to dig my way out of this. All right. So anyway, at this point in time, the color purple, and you know what's going through my mind right now? Purple rain, purple rain. All right, can't get it out. All right. The color purple was the most expensive color there was. The pigment that you had to get to dye something purple was very rare. It was highly expensive. So only the ultra rich could afford purple clothes because what made purple clothes was so rare to find. So Jesus, in his fictional character, is trying to help us understand this dude is like fat and happy, seriously fat and happy rich, all right? He has purple clothes, fine linen, and he feasts sumptuously. The terminology used would, in our world would be, he's able to gorge himself on the most expensive gourmet kind of cooking out there, all right? He actually can afford the organic, shade-grown, fair trade, food that the rest of us would like to eat, but we like to eat. So he is feasting sumptuously. He's able to gorge on this to his fullest every single evening, all right? So they have a picture of this first character, this filthy rich guy who is massively fat and happy. Now, the second character is quite the opposite. The second character is a man named Lazarus, and in verse 20, Jesus says, "And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus. He's covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores." Now, this poor man that Jesus comes up with is the only parable in the Bible, by the way, where Jesus assigns one of the characters in his story a name. This is going to have significance in a few minutes when we get to the end of this. So just kind of put that in the back of your mind. He assigns the name of Lazarus to this guy. Now, his situation is dire. His situation is that he is so poor and he's so sick. He doesn't have the money to care for himself. He's so sick that he cannot even walk. And so in this story, his friends, his family, lay him down at the feet of this rich man's house, all right, at the gate. They lay him at this house. Why? In hopes that it's his last hope. He's got no hope left. And so what he's hoping for is the table scraps that this man eats off of, all right? So this picture here is really interesting. As I was studying some commentators and things that were talking about, again, the historical context, the wealthy of the day would wipe their hands clean with bread. Now, so you can understand this, when we went to Ethiopia, they served their food on what's called injera. It's this big, like, huge piece of bread. And you rip the bread off, and you take the bread, and you get the morsel of food with the bread, and you eat it. All right, there were no utensils then, and so the traditional method of eating in Ethiopia, when they do traditional food, they'll eat that way. All right, now they have utensils and stuff now, but when they do the traditional restaurant, and so you have to take this food and you dip this food up and you eat it by using the bread. Well, naturally, you're going to get food all over you. So what the wealthy would do, and this is interesting for all you white bread lovers, they would use white bread to wipe their hands with. They didn't think it was worth eating with. They used it as a napkin. And so they would take the white bread and they would wipe all of the juices and the grease and the oil off of their hands with that, and they would ball it up into a ball and throw it on the ground. This is what Jesus is referring to. Now, all of his audience would have well known that, all right? It was part of their customs and culture. What this poor man Lazarus is hoping to eat is literally the napkins, the bread napkins that this rich man throws on the ground that he wipes the food off of his hands with. This is what he's longing for. This man is in such dire condition that he's willing to eat bread napkins. That's what he wants to eat. But it gets worse than that. He's laid at this doorstep, and Jesus says this character, this person Lazarus, he can't even run the dogs off that are coming to lick his wounds. These sores. And so the saliva of these dogs getting in these wounds and the acid burning these things and the bacteria, because dogs like to lick stuff. And so that is nothing gross to me when somebody like has their dog going, the dog's licking them. I'm like, do you know what your dog licks? I'm just saying, and then eats, They're like, poop, oh, look. It's like, you ever see a kid throw up, dog runs over, eats it, and then you got little, that's gross, man. I ain't lying. That is just some, So anyway, Jesus uses this illustration that's that gross. It's gross. This guy's got sores all over him. The dogs are licking the wounds. He's hoping to eat bread napkins, and he is absolutely just totally unable to move to the extent he can't even run these dogs off. But he gives him a name in this parable that's interesting. Jesus calls him Lazarus. To the ancients, your meaning of your name was significant. It was something you wore as a badge. Some people would change their name so that the meaning would match what their life was about. To us, it's kind of a novelty. We might know what our name means, but it doesn't really mean anything to us. But to the ancients, it did. Listen to what one commentator said about this name, Lazarus. Perhaps Jesus picked the name Lazarus because it is the Greek form of the Hebrew name, which means God the Helper. Lazarus was righteous not because he was poor, but because he was dependent on God. He depended on God. His very name meant that he depended on God. God is my helper. So I want you to understand something. Jesus is not implying that this man is a good man because he's poor. We live in this cultural warfare, all right, where if you're rich, you're evil. If you're poor, you're godly. If you're middle income, you're godly. If you're rich, you're evil. Everybody else is good. The evil people have money. Listen, that is a scary train of thought. If you study history, the people and the societies that get caught up at that, those are the societies that we now call China. That we used to call the Soviet Union and now call Russia. Communism plagues on the snowball effect of that somehow who has and who does not have determines your destiny and your worth and your value in good and evil. The Bible is not embracing that whatsoever. You can go to hell just as fast poor as you can rich. All right? So Jesus is not saying that this man is good because he's poor. But he does let us get in on his name, Lazarus, which means God the helper, and thus implying in this story that this is one whose dependency and faith is in God. Now, we move forward in the story. Verse 22, what happens? We got a rich man, we got a poor man named Lazarus who's in a horrible, horrific condition. What happens next? Well, verse 22 says, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. If you were here a few months ago, you remember I did a sermon where we were talking about how people were constantly vying for position at these parties. When you would go to a party in this day and age, those who got to sit closest to the host were considered the most valuable people there. They were the most important. Politicians and religious leaders would not go to a party unless they were guaranteed to sit close to the host because they wouldn't want anybody to think that they were somehow not important. So if they were invited to a party that they were going to be seated at the end of the table, all right, they would avoid that party because people would see them at the end of the table and go, well, I thought he was important. What's he doing down there? Maybe he's not important. And so all of this had a really big importance in their society. So it's really interesting here that the one who was laid at the foot of this extremely hyper-wealthy man who was in this horrible, horrible, hellish condition is now seated beside Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish faith. I mean, like in the Jewish faith, there is God, and right underneath the God is Abraham. This is one of the most important people in their culture. He's long dead, but he is one of the pillars of their faith. And so Abraham, here's this poor, impoverished man who's begging for bread napkins, having dogs licking his wound, can't fend him off. He's now seated beside Abraham in heaven, in paradise. By contrast, the rich man in the second half of verse 22 also died and was buried. If you notice Lazarus, there was nothing about him being buried. He simply carried away. That would have again been understood in their culture. Those who died on the streets, who were homeless and jobless and had no money, they would just be put into a pauper's grave and their body just basically done away with. However, when a rich man died, most wealthy would actually leave money on their estates to hire people to mourn at their death. It's a custom that's still carried out today in a lot of ways in the Middle East. Whenever there's an uproar and you see a funeral in the Middle East, you see all these people like down the road wailing and hollering and screaming and yelling. There's a good chance most of those people don't even know who's in the box. But it's a part of culture that when there's a death, they would, at least the rich at this point, would pay mourners to come in, and they would cry all day, and they would walk around beating themselves, and they'd be like, who you dying? I'm like, oh, this week it's Bill. I hear next week I might have Sam. And so that was a part of making a big to-do about yourself. And you were guaranteed that yourself was going to be made a big to-do even after your death. He'd have been then placed in a grave, and all the specialties would have been done. A stone would have been rolled in front. His body would have been cared for. All these things would have happened to this rich man. None of that would have happened to Lazarus. So the rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. Besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. Now, I want to just pause real quick. We obviously have a description of some kind of hell, all right? So we have this poor man who dies and is seated with Abraham in Abraham's bosom, right? So he's seated with Abraham. There's a chasm between them, and then on the other side of that chasm is a place that is awful, where he's being tormented, right? He desires for Lazarus just to bring him over just a drop of water. The irony that all Lazarus had wanted in this life was just his bread handkerchief, his bread napkin. And so he's in this physically horrible place, right? This experientially horrible place that is very different from what he sees Lazarus in. But it seems to be in some like general area that is kind of big picture the same place, just split in half. One's great, one's not. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to read you verbatim what I felt was a really good summary of the terminology used in the Bible about heaven and hell. It's very important that we at least get the concept of the terminology, because this is really going to bring us to our conclusion here in a few minutes. I want you to listen to, this is R.J. Utley's commentary. This is what he said. In the OT, that's the Old Testament, the dead are gathered to a conscious but silent and inactive holding place called Sheol. Some of you may have heard that. The Greek counterpoint to this was Hades. That was the Greek word for Sheol. The place of the unseen, the place of the dead. In both the Old Testament and New Testament, all humans at death went to this holding place. The rabbis asserted that it was divided into a section for the wicked, Tartarus, and a section for the righteous, Paradise. There may be evidence for this in Luke 23:43, but to be fair, Paul uses the same term, heaven, blah, blah, blah. All right, now, so you understand so far. In the Jewish mind at this time when Jesus is teaching this parable, their understanding of the afterlife is that there's a place called Sheol, all right? That's where everybody goes. And inside of Sheol is a place that is a paradise, and that paradise is separated by a chasm from those who are in the non-paradise. This place called Tartarus, this evil place, this horrible place, all right? So that is their concept of the afterlife at this point. In 2 Peter 2:4, and possibly referred to in Jude 6, the term Tartarus is used for the holding place of rebellious angels. In Greek mythology, it was a prison under Hades for the half-human, half-divine Titans. Made for some good movies. In Jewish interbiblical apocalyptic, I'm about to hurt myself, apocalyptic literature, it was a special holding place for the rebellious angels, possibly related to Genesis 6, according to 1 Enoch, which, by the way, Enoch is a book in the Catholic Bible, a section called the Apocrypha. We believe it's historically accurate. We just don't accept it as inspired part of the Bible. The third New Testament term is Gehenna. Now, this is the one that is most popular in the teachings of Jesus. Jesus used this term more than anybody. And this word Gehenna is translated into the English by the King James Version as hell. The Hebrew term is a contraction of the Hebrew phrase, the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom. Now, this is where it gets really important for us to understand. This valley, south of Jerusalem, was where the Phoenician fire god Moloch, this Valley of Hinnom, is where the Phoenician fire god Moloch was worshipped by child sacrifice. Some of you are like, I like that God. My child's crazy. So they would take their children. Many times a firstborn child would be down there and be sacrificed. All right, and sacrifice isn't you get to take care of them. Sacrifice is dead. Even King Manasseh participated in this idolatry. The Jews of the first century had turned this area into a garbage dump for Jerusalem. Many people feel even dead bodies, perhaps Lazarus' body, would have been placed there. Jesus used the metaphors associated with this garbage dump, fire, smoke, smell, worms, to describe eternal punishment. Now, the term Gehenna only occurs once outside of the words of Jesus. Now, I wanted to stop there real quick. There are many people who feel like the concept of hell is one that flies in the face of God and spirituality. Listen, Jesus used the most explicit term of hell than in all the Bible. The one who speaks of hell more than anybody is Jesus. So the idea that we can kind of have this Oprah thing going on where everybody goes to heaven and it's all good and a loving God would never have hell, the very person who died to save us is the one who speaks of hell more than anybody, and he uses the most explicit, horrifying, grotesque terminology of anybody in the Bible. The only other time it's mentioned is in James that they use this terminology. This place was prepared for the devil and his angels, but rebellious, unrepentant humans will share their isolation. Now, we'll get into more of this next year. This particular author feels that no one is in this Gehenna hell today, that it will only be occupied after Judgment Day. At the end of time, there's a Judgment Day, and all those who are not in Christ are cast into the lake of fire in Revelation, and this particular author feels the lake of fire is Gehenna, and prior to that, there's a different hell, and I won't go into all that. We'll talk about that next year, all right? But can we just all agree hell's bad? All right, I did have a couple kids in Pensacola came up to me one day, said they were Satanists and they felt that there were good places in hell. And I was like, what? Really? I said, I want you to try something out. Go home and tell your mama that her biscuits taste like hell and see if she thinks there's any positive statement in that whatsoever. None. All right? So the very concept of hell is as negative as it gets. Fourth, the last term is heaven. It is described in a beautiful, expensive metaphors from the earth. The only vocabulary that biblical authors had was earthly. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. The Bible does not discuss or describe the afterlife, either heaven or hell, in specific terms. It doesn't describe in specific terms, probably because they are beyond our ability to comprehend. The best thing about heaven is that heaven is not its splendor, but the presence of the triune God and the possibility, which I don't like his choice of words there, because it's not a possibility, it's a guarantee of fellowship with him. Now, that's an overview. That is an overview of what the Jewish listeners to this story would have been thinking about the terminology. They understood what Gehenna was. That was their concept of Sheol. That was their concept of the afterlife. Everything that Jesus has said to this point in this parable is totally normal. All right, he said nothing that anybody in the audience, none of the religious leaders would have went, all right, nothing. This is where he drops it like it's hot. All right? This is where it goes crazy. Verse 27. And he said, it's continuing in the parable. The rich man says this, I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. So send Lazarus, raise Lazarus from the dead, go out here and tell them this is real. But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear. The rich man replies, no, Father Abraham, but if someone goes from the dead, if Lazarus is raised from the dead and goes, they will repent. And he said to them, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, if they won't listen to the scriptures, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Now, right away, some of you are probably thinking Jesus is prophetically pointing to his own resurrection. And that's totally acceptable. That's cool. But we also have an interesting correlation here with this last verse, with something that's going to happen in a matter of weeks. One commentator put it this way. Jesus was obviously suggesting the rich man symbolized the Pharisees. They wanted signs. If you read the Gospels, the Pharisees are all the time asking Jesus, prove you're God, show us a sign, do something. And Jesus would do miracles and they would ignore them every time. That's why Jesus in this parable and looking at these religious leaders that have just mocked them and telling them about hell and a rich man that was there who's trying to get Lazarus to go back and warn his brothers of the reality of hell if they don't submit to God. It's interesting that he points to these men who refuse to believe in Jesus, that the law and the prophets are all they need to know who he is. But since they refused to believe the scriptures, they would not believe any sign, no matter how great. Here's where it's interesting. Just a short time later, Jesus did raise a man from the dead, another man, and his name was Lazarus. Isn't that interesting? In this parable, Jesus tells of a man named Lazarus and says, in this fictional story, if he's raised from the dead, it will not matter. Because if you're unwilling to believe in the words of God, then it won't matter what happens in front of you. So what happened when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead? Well, the result was the religious leaders began to plot more earnestly to kill both Jesus and Lazarus. They not only wanted to kill Jesus, they wanted to kill Lazarus. So what can we imply from this? What can we safely imply? This is for your notes, all right? That's our story. That's the depth of it, the context of it, what it's all about. What can we safely imply from this story? And by safely, remember, we don't want to overreach. This is a fictional story where Jesus is trying to teach an absolute truth. So what can we draw in the context of that story, in the context of Scripture, what can we safely imply about hell and then by the opposite of that, heaven? Number one, this is in your bulletin. You might want to fill in a little blank there and take it home and think it through on your own. Number one, heaven and hell are not three-dimensional physical places, measurable by space, time, and matter. Our universe operates underneath of space, time, and matter. Everything down to the smallest part of an atom occupies a space. It occupies that space in time, and it has substance, matter. Even energy is a form of matter. So without space, time, matter, it does not exist in our universe. You with me so far? Some of y'all are going, Just agree, okay? If you're not in all three, if one of those is missing, you don't exist. Simple as that. Heaven and hell are apart from space, time, and matter. God exists apart from space, time, and matter. Space, time, and matter is something God created. It operates under Him, but He is not governed by it. He existed before that existed. So when the Bible is trying to describe to us heaven and hell, it cannot give us exact terminology because the only thing that we have in our universe is relegated by space, time, and matter. Therefore, our language is. So heaven and hell are not three-dimensional physical places measurable by space, time, and matter. The Bible uses physical images to help us understand the very real and consciously experienced, very real, very consciously experienced qualities of both. But they are spiritual realities, not physical. The moment you try to make heaven and hell a three-dimensional thing like earth, then you're going to start digging thinking you're going to find it. And all you're going to do is hit China. All right? The moment you think heaven is a physical place that exists somewhere out in space, all right? There were people who believe that that God is moving further and further from the earth because we've sent satellites out, and the closer the satellites get to heaven, I was taught this as a kid by some Sunday school teachers, all right? They meant well, they just didn't know the Bible. And I remember them saying, yeah, so we send these satellites out, God's going to keep moving heaven further and further away from us. The further we go, this space program needs to go away. Apparently Obama believes it. He got rid of the space program. I don't know. It was a joke. All right, so there's people that believe that. Those are people who see heaven and hell as three-dimensional space-time matter places. That is the wrong way to view heaven and hell because the Bible is not attempting to suggest that. It's describing them with the only thing that we have available to us, and that are things measured by space, time, and matter. Now, second, people are fully conscious in both heaven and hell. That is clearly taught in this passage. You cannot miss that one in this, all right? Heaven and hell are both places of true existence where our spirit thinks, sees, hears, communicates, feels, makes decisions, has emotions, etc., 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 etc. Now you say, why are you telling me that? Well, the New Age concepts that have really become popular since the late 60s in America are actually rooted in ancient religions of Hinduism and Buddhism. And Hinduism and Buddhism, when you eventually get out of the cycle of reincarnation, you're cycled into the universe where you are one with the universe. You no longer exist. You don't have an identity forever. Your identity is the universe. You become a part of the universe. And so there is no individuality in those concepts of eternity. You die to become one with everybody, and now we're all somehow mystically a part of one another. And that's the end of that, all right? So the goal of life in those religions is to eventually not be an individual. As long as you're an individual, you'll be suffering, so your individuality needs to die so that you can be one with the world and you'll no longer suffer. The gospel is radically different. The gospel teaches of a very real eternity that you will experience for eternity. Your body is absent from that, all right? The Bible teaches to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. It is a reality. So our spirit that is real, that thinks, sees, smells, exists, processes, it is who we are. It is our identity, exists forever in one reality or the other, heaven or hell, as an individual who feels and experiences as an individual. That is clearly seen in this passage and is a very safe implication to make. Third, heaven exceeds what is imaginably awesome. It's like the movie Capanda, as my son calls it. Awesomeness. It has lots of awesomeness. Hell exceeds what is imaginably terrible. If you can imagine it as terrible, hell's worse. If you can imagine it as great, heaven's better. Whether there is a literal fire in hell or not is not the point. I've listened, maybe some of you have been in some of these debates at work. There are people who think that the Bible teaches there is a literal fire in hell. Some people think that there's not. I've heard pastors get up and tell me you were going to go to hell if you didn't believe there was a little fire in hell. Whether there's a fire in hell is really not the point. All right? It's really not the point. Hell's bad. All right? That's the point. The clear and blunt point is that hell is unimaginably horrifying. Horrible. That's the point. And if you're hung up on something other than that, you're missing the point. Fourth, our eternal destiny is determined by our response to the truth of Christ, and it is permanent. That is very clearly taught in this passage. There's a chasm between the two of them, and you cannot cross it. Jesus made it a huge point in his story. The rich man understood he was toast and wanted to send back word to his friends. It is so clearly communicated. The reality of our soul at our physical death is the reality of our soul for eternity. Now this is where I want to just take a very short tangent, and then I'm going to give you 2 challenge points and we're done. Some of you are here today and you're an honest seeker of the gospel. In other words, you've never given your life to Christ, but you're really thinking this thing through. And part of the holdup for you, and for many, is the idea that how can a loving God condemn somebody to hell? I mean, how can God do that? If he loves me, and the Bible's all about all this spirituality and all this grace and God's mercy, how can a loving God send somebody to something that is eternally more horrible than anything I can ever imagine? Well, the best way that I can help you with this is to simply explain it how Jesus explained it. In John chapter 12, Jesus said this, I have come into the world as light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. If anyone hears my words, so in other words, you were in darkness, I came to get you out of it. If anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. The world was already judged of itself. The one who rejects me and does not receive my words has a judge. The words I have spoken will judge him on that last day. For I have not spoken of my own authority, but the Father who sent me has himself given me a commandment, what to say and what to speak. And I know that his commandment is eternal life. What I say, therefore I say as the Father has told me. Let me just basically illustrate it to you this way. All right, Jesus is suggesting this. All right, not suggesting, he's saying, this is what Jesus is saying. God's a just God. You choose your eternity. Hell is essentially an eternity of your own making. In every fashion, shape, and form of the word. It is of your own making in the sense that you said you didn't want God. When you died, you lived with eternity for what you wanted. Jesus very clearly taught that man has condemned himself. Man's already messed up. I've come to rescue man and to redeem man. I didn't come to judge the world. The gospel is not judgment. The gospel is redemption. The gospel is trying to get us out of our depravity, trying to get us out of the hell that we make of ourselves. And so Jesus came to give us life. He didn't come to give judgment. He came to give life and life abundantly. So what does that say then? We as mankind, we live in darkness and hell of ourselves. We produce it in and of ourselves. So when we die and we say no to God, then we are saying yes to ourselves, and it's an eternity of ourself, of our own making. Now somebody say, well, man, that sounds great. Man, I would love for eternity to do whatever I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it. Why would I want to be in heaven under some king and his authority and live in eternity with him when I could live for eternity with myself? You know, the central doctrine of Satanism is not like to go kill chickens and sacrifice your neighbor's kids. The central doctrine of Satanism is that you're your own God, serve yourself. That's the central doctrine of Satanism. You see it in the very beginning in the garden. So what's the result of that? What could be so bad about a world where I get to do what I want to do? What could be so bad about that? Well, you know what's interesting? In our culture, there's enough of the gospel and enough of God. I hear people say, the reason why I don't believe in God is that there's so much evil in the world. And I always say, the reason I do believe in God is because one of the reasons I do believe in God is I've traveled the world and I've seen what a world looks like without him. And so the only way that there's any good in the world is if God does exist. If there wasn't God, there would be no hope for man at any level. Mankind is messed up. This lunatic that just went into Colorado and shot everybody has the same depravity that Adolf Hitler had and the same depravity that Austin Rammel has. And left up to myself, the eternal snowball of that looks no better and no worse than the most horrific Holocaust visualizations that you've ever seen. I've been on airplanes and I've flown. I've been in the favelas of Brazil. I've been around Rio in these things called the favelas where the only time the police go in them, they're so horrible that the police simply go in to pick up the dead bodies and bring them out. They govern themselves. And I thought it was a good idea to take a bunch of college students in there to do ministry in the favelas. Here we go, boys. We were in an orphanage in that favela outside of Rio, up on the mountain. Some of the most beautiful land in the world is the mountains above Rio de Janeiro. They've been overtook by these favelas, these slums. Favela is a flower that overnight will bloom. It's a beautiful flower. It just comes out of nowhere overnight. And so the Brazilians named those favelas because just overnight they would just pop up on these beautiful mountainsides that overlook Rio de Janeiro. So we were up in there and we went to a daycare center where one of the rival drug lords has his children during the day. We got there and we noticed a line of bullet holes along the wall. You see, the day before, a rival drug lord had come to try to kill that drug lord's kids that are in that daycare. While we were in the daycare, they marched out the guy who snitched about, a few, maybe 50 feet, 100 feet from where we were, marched him out in the middle of the street and beheaded him in the middle of the street. How's that to take a bunch of Liberty students to? We heard all the ruckus outside. We didn't know what it was about. They didn't let us go out so we wouldn't, end up in a mess. But life in that favela is some of the most horrifying existence in the world. I've been in Africa, inside of the slums of Africa, where you see some of the most impoverished people, not some of, the most impoverished people in the world. As I stood and watched serving food last December in 2010, I guess it was, serving food at an Ethiopian nonprofit organization. It's all Ethiopian driven. They do everything themselves. And so we're serving food to homeless folks. And here comes a man who's completely crippled. He can't see. He's blind. He's being led. He has his steel. He's totally crippled up. And he comes up and he gets his food. He lives on the street every day of his life. And the line went on forever of people just like him. The crime, when I was in Kenya, they said you're better to be mugged by a street person than arrested by a police officer. So you see, in our society, we have kind of the squeaky little clean society. Even in the ugly parts of our society, there's a squeaky clean to it that the rest of the world longs to be a part of. But when you get out of this system of protection and organization that we have in our culture that masks human depravity, when we see the thing in Colorado, we're all shocked by it. What happened at Virginia Tech the other year, we're shocked by it. You see, but that goes on around the world every day of the week. When we were in Honduras, the guys will tell you every morning, we went downstairs to see the newspaper and the dozens of people that were killed in that city that day as the drug lords are killing each other off. Every day. You see, that is human nature being shown for itself. How many watched the movie Prison Break? The show Prison Break. How many see that movie? Doesn't that suck you in? Man, I'm so glad I watched that thing on DVD. If not, I would have been mad. It's one of those shows where you get to the end of it and you're like, are you serious? And you got to play the next one. You're like, you're not going to answer that question. And I'd stay up all night. I'm going to watch everything. It was just like losing. I come to work next day. What happened? Prison Break. had to find out what happened. You know it's fake, right? It's not. It's real. I had to know. But not to spoil it for those of you who haven't seen it, right? Eventually they end up in a third world prison. It's an interesting thing about third world prisons. The police don't go in them. The police stay outside of the prisons to keep everybody in. The prisons are run by the inmates. It's some of the most awful, horrific environment that anybody could ever live. But when you look in that, you literally see a picture of hell. What you see is mankind, dog-eat-dog world, the survival of the fittest, where the depravity of man is unleashed and caged in. Now, if you think for a moment that I would let my son or my daughter spend 1 second in that, you've lost your mind. That's exactly what hell is. Hell is nothing more of an eternity of man's pride and arrogance unleashed. Man's greed unleashed. And whether there's fire or not in that is really pointless. It is man choosing to be his own God, and he is unleashed in it, and that is the most horrifying thing in the world. There is not a den of wolves that matches the evil of what mankind can do when he is unleashed to his own greed and selfishness. So what we have is a picture of heaven where God reigns in righteousness and glory and beauty and justice. That when we submit our lives to Him, we get to live in that beauty and that glory for eternity, and that is heaven. On the other side, we have a hell where everyone exists that said no to God, I will be my own God, and that is unleashed for an eternity. And it is awful and it is just because every person there has said, I am my own God. Multiply that times eternity and billions of people. That's not a pretty sight, but it's a just sight. You went to your grave into eternity wanting to be your own God, and that's where you'll rest. So what's our challenge this morning? Very quickly, 2 things and we're done. Our spirituality is the most important part of our identity. Why? Because it's the only part of our identity that is eternal. This is what this rich man finally realized. It was just too late. He had prioritized everything. This fictional character prioritized everything and found value in everything other than what was eternal. He had said no to God his whole life. We are spiritual beings living in a physical body. I'm going to talk more about this next week. I hope you come back and bring some friends. We're spiritual beings living in a physical body, not physical beings with a spirit as a side item. Meaning this, we need to evaluate from what vantage point we're truly living our life. How am I viewing life? Lazarus, God, the helper, viewed life through the window of spirituality. God is my helper, God is my identity, and no matter what situation I find myself in physically, my life is beyond this world and this circumstance. And I can have joy and freedom and victory and life no matter what this world throws at me, because my vantage point and my perspective is not this world. But when your vantage point is not spiritual, whether it be blatantly religious or blatantly rebellious to God, whatever it is, they're all the same thing. When your vantage point is this world, then you're going to try to treat your condition with things of this world, and this world is a fruit and a product of us. It's hell. Man, it's beautiful to see. God created that part. But the quality of existence in this world is hell. We just live in a society that protects us from some of it. So we view this world as our priority, and that doesn't make any sense. I say, wait, man, me. We start defining our value and our purpose and what matters in life with what car we drive, what kind of house I have, and what kind of food I have in the fridge. If I can afford steaks, or if I have to eat peanut butter and jelly, and how far up the ladder I've gone in work, and how much recognition I've gotten, how many friends I have, how many people acknowledge my existence. All of that is hell. All of that is of this world, and you can't take it with you. It's at best neutral. I mean, nothing's wrong with money, but it's neutral. It's like going to the Chinese restaurant. You eat a lot of rice and you're filled up for an hour, and then you're starving to death an hour later. Right? Am I the only one who does that? Or am I just weird like that? So what vantage point are you viewing your life? Lazarus viewed it from a spiritual perspective, and his was in a horrible predicament. The rich man viewed his as great. But look how it ended. Second question. I don't want to be, well, the text demands that I ask you this. You know what I mean? I'm not a hellfire and brimstone kind of guy, and I do not manipulate people into trusting God. I teach the truth. I try to challenge you from how it challenges me. And what I get convicted about, I try to spill that into you and share it with you. That first challenge point, by the way, is one that deeply convicts me and I deal with on a frequent basis, defining my life by so many things of this world and so much of what God created instead of the Creator. The second one is just and even more obvious in the text, and it's one that you got to answer. It's real. If you were to die right now, what will your eternal reality be? Heaven or hell? Listen, folks, you got to answer that. It is as real and as close to you as a nose on your face. The Bible says it is appointed unto man once to die. Every one of us is going to die. It's going to happen. Death is all around us. Somehow we think it's not going to happen to us. I've done funerals for people in every age group. I've seen death in my life in every age group. Child all the way up. Death is no respecter of persons. It is coming to us all, and the eternal reality that you will exist in forever is determined by the decision that you will make now. You say, now in this instant? Maybe, I don't know. But now in the instance of this life, and you don't know how long yours is. I'm not trying to manipulate you, because I'm not going to give you some secret prayer. If you'll say this prayer, then you got it cured. That doesn't exist. No such thing. The question is, what reality you're going to enter in, yours or God's? And that is determined by the reality that you're in now. Now, some of you may vehemently disagree with me. Hey, listen, I respect you on that. That's cool. But you cannot read the scriptures and say that the scriptures teach anything other than what I'm saying with any level of intellectual integrity. There are those who suggest it doesn't. They have no integrity in their interpretation of Scripture. And there are people, even secular scholars, aren't even Christians, who would say that. The teachings of Jesus are as plain, as I said, the nose on your face. The question is, are you going to believe that it's Jesus and He's God, and that's what He, and what He, if He is, then you got to take it that way. If you don't believe that He's God, then you have the right to have your own belief. But if you're going to say Jesus is God and this is His word, then you cannot come up with any other conclusion than Jesus clearly taught He's the way, the truth, the life, and no man goes to the Father but through me. And the reality that you die in is the reality that you will live in the rest of eternity, and eternity has no end. That we're all going to die, and nobody knows when it's going to happen. So you need to make a decision.